Okay, we just finished recording with Dr. Gregory Soderbergh. Greg, what do you think? What should people be
Yeah, it's
excited
fun
for?
to get a historian's perspective. I think he's the first. Well, maybe Oz could be considered a historian, but Oz is kind of like he does everything. But yeah, he's an
He's
everything
like an
guy.
everything
But
man. Yeah.
Dr. Soderbergh is a historian. He's coming at it through a different lens, and so I think it'll be a unique take, helping us sort through what culture is, how do we engage it, how do we change it, and he's got a very nice flowing beard.
He does.
But
You guys won't be able to see
you
that,
can
but you
imagine it.
may
You
be
can hear
able to
whispering
hear.
in the mic.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It adds like a nice uh
Yeah,
ambiance,
yeah.
can
You
I
can you
say,
can
to
you
the
can
whole
smell its
conversation.
must in the
So,
air
but
as you listen. Mm.
yeah, just imagine. One thing I've thought was interesting is that probably a lot of people have heard of the Benedict option, and maybe less people have heard of the Boniface option. But these options of what does it look like to engage with our culture and people wrestling through those questions, and he comes and offers us the Bugenhagen option.
I think
It's
you're
hard to
saying
say
it wrong,
Bugenhagen
but
option, but I think
it's Bugenhagen.
yeah, of course I am. Uh, but I think that it really is a helpful thing because he does get into four categories of focus for cultural reformation, cultural building, those sorts of things. So I really do think that's worth listening to. So
Listen to it.
yeah, guys,
Also, you
without
should
further
sign
ado,
up on our Patreon so you can get the After Hours edition or whatever it's called. Ale House.
exactly right. Yeah, the Ale House. Listen to the Ale House. Without further ado, Dr. Gregory Soderbergh. Welcome to Kingdom and Culture, where we equip the King's wardens to know his charge and labor unto glory. I'm David, and with me as always is my co-host Craig, and we interview thinkers and theologians from around the world to explore the themes of faith, culture, and the lordship of Christ. All right, guys, we are back, and we're here with Dr. Gregory Soderbergh. So, Dr. Soderbergh, will you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us what you do and who you are?
Yes, well, thank you for this opportunity. I actually teach a guy who's at your church, and he speaks very highly of both of you, of your church and your school. So, yeah, we're basically neighbors. I mean, you're down the road down in Yakima, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm over here in Moscow, Idaho. So, same neck of the woods.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm a career teacher. I've been a teacher since I graduated from college, and so currently, well, after spending a lot of years in regular schools, made the switch to online schooling kind of with the COVID shutdowns, and have kind of stayed in that space since then. So my main job is I'm teaching at a platform which is called Kepler Education. And so that's a classical Christian online consortium of teachers. Also teach at two other places online. One is called Redemption Seminary, and the other is called the Bible Mesh Institute. And so those both work with graduate students primarily. But yeah, I'm also involved with some other things. Serve on the editorial board of the Consortium Journal, which is a journal that is trying to promote classical Christian education. Also, am a associate fellow at the Kirby Lang Center for Public Theology, which is based in Cambridge, but it's really a worldwide network of scholars and kind of focusing on what is public theology and how do we do theology that actually is helpful and is responsive to what's going on in the culture around us. And besides that, we do have 5 kids, 3 of whom are adults, and so that is our main ministry, of course.
Yeah. Amen. That is awesome. I've also you also I guess well, I know you've written for the American Reformer. That's part of what we're going to talk to you today. An article you wrote on the Bugenhagen option, or Bugenhagen option. I guess you can correct how I say it later. Uh, but I know you've written there, and so yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time coming on here. You've obviously busy guy with all the things that you're doing, and so without further ado, let's jump in so we don't waste too much of your time. Um,
Sounds good.
Great. So the first question that we like to ask our guests is, what is culture? How do you define it? What's your conception of it?
Mm. Well, yeah. Thank you for the reminder about my writing. Yes, I am also a part-time writer, so
Hmm.
I do like to write and have written quite a few articles by this point, and I have contributed to some books. But yeah, we can maybe post some links to that maybe in the show notes if
Yes.
folks want to chase down those writings. But yeah, so culture. I love looking at the root of words. My students know that one of my favorite websites is the online etymology site, where you can really get at the history of words. So I'm sure they
That's
think,
awesome.
oh no, another word tangent, but you know. So culture comes from the Latin cultura, which means to cultivate. So it's an agricultural term, and so kind of developed over time and really wasn't popular until the 19th century in the sense that we use it now. So it's a relatively new word in human history. So that's interesting in itself. But culture, I think, is whatever is cultivated. So
Mm,
whatever we cultivate, that produces the culture. And if you think of us as, you know, we're all growing in this culture, we're part of it. And so it's kind of, it goes both ways. We cultivate the culture, but we're also cultivated by the culture. And so I think that's the big tension we all have here is, are we actively um, affecting our culture, or are we just growing along with everyone else in the field or in the flower bed?
What are the ways that you see?
yeah.
Sorry,
And
David,
so
I spoke first. What are
no, go for
I like that. I like the root word. I like we're both cultivating culture and we're cultivated by it, and it's kind of the cyclical pattern. What are the ways that you think we actually? How do we cultivate culture though? Like, what does that actually look like?
Mm. Yes, great question. Well, um, I don't think it means that we try to fit in, and uh, and I think this is a common temptation of the church, and perhaps this is something that we've always struggled with, to simply mirror the broader culture. So we can't do that. We need to actively create culture that is informed by God's word and by the best of the Christian tradition. Um, so just some examples. You know, I live here in Moscow, Idaho. Um, Originally Jim Wilson. He was an evangelist. He moved here because it was close to two universities. So it was a place that was it was very strategic. And he was an ex-military guy, and so he thought this is a great way to impact the culture of these two colleges, of these two towns with a lot of academics and so on. So I forget how many years since the 70s, I think. So now we have multiple Christian businesses. My boys have been able to play on the local rugby team, and we actually go over and play you guys in Yakima. And so
awesome.
most of the people on the team are actually Christians, but not primarily. And so we have a culture of boys working hard, learning how to get hit, how to get back up again, how not to lose their tempers when they do get hit. My son got punched in the eye at one point. He had to learn to turn the other cheek, quite literally.
Yeah.
Um, but we also have a rich culture of music, and coming out of the music of the church, we have a very high standard in our worship in church. but we also have a local rock and roll band. My other son plays in that. It's all
Nice.
Christian guys who like to rock out. So actively starting businesses, um, doing things, um, and just doing things in a trying to do them in a distinctly Christian way, whether it is running a business or playing rugby, um, and
Nice. So
seeing
it's
how the
kind of
Bible
like
applies to all of that.
I think what you gave us is a lot of different categories that we create in different spheres of life, in relationships, in business, and it's all kind of any place that we engage and we build stuff institutionally. The things that we're building in the world are
Mm,
creating our cultivation, and you can either do it in a Christian way or non-Christian way. And
Mhm.
it is interesting to think how that actually impacts us. And there's like a feedback loop, and like you can probably get that momentum, like you have in places like where you live in Moscow. You kind of create probably a momentum where things kind of beget more things. And the other can be true too if you start losing ground.
Right, right,
and so, I guess even with that, you're thinking about cultivating culture. If we're supposed to cultivate it, I assume that means we have a goal in mind with our cultivation. And so, maybe just looking forward for this conversation, maybe go into what is our goal in cultivation, and then talk about. I would like to transition into talking about the Bugenhagen option and how that helps get us to that goal of cultivating the culture.
right. Yes, great question. Well, I think the first goal is to be faithful, and so
Mhm.
I don't want anyone to feel bad because they live in a place that is surrounded. Say they live in Babylon, perhaps, right? But whether you're in Babylon or in in the land of Judah, your obligation is primarily to be faithful, and to worship God, to have a godly family culture, and to build houses, seek the peace of the city wherever you are, whether in New York or North Korea or Moscow, Idaho, which is a very strange place. I mean, let's just, we're in a very strange bubble. Um, so being faithful wherever you are, and working as hard as you can in that context, but also not just having your horizon and your imagination limited by your present circumstances. So not just rolling over and saying, well, let's just wait till the rapture happens. So I think American Christians have we're historic. We have a bad case of historical amnesia. We don't know the past primarily because it's not taught well in our schools. Um, so yeah, we need well. So moving into the Bugenhagen option, maybe we should just um, move into that because that gives us kind of a framework
Yeah.
to think about this. So yeah, I was first exposed to Johannes Bugenhagen, and probably not doing the exact German way. Apologies to any German speakers out there, but
We do,
it's something like
we do have a
Bugenhagen.
very
But
large German
we'll just say
audience,
it
so
the
let
American.
us know how to say it right.
Oh, oh boy, yeah. So I was exposed to him in a history of Christian education, which actually wasn't a very good book, and someone needs to write a better one. But it's the only one really out there at the time. So yeah, he was mentioned in there, and so yeah, Bugenhagen was the great administrator, the great implementer of the Lutheran Reformation. So he was eventually actually Luther's pastor, and so he was one of Luther's best friends. Um, and so Bugenhagen was able to do a lot that Luther couldn't do. Number one, because Luther was in hiding for about a year, and Bugenhagen had some of those diplomatic skills that, let's just say, Luther didn't have. Right? Uh, Luther was very good at offense. He was good at attack. But he also was convinced that if you didn't agree with him, then you were a pawn of the devil. Right?
Mhm.
So Bugenhagen was able to work with various German cities who were interested in reform to implement church reform and also social reform. So as I learned more about him, just studying church history, I'm a church history guy. My degrees are all in church history. Just read more about him in various places, and just kind of noticed a pattern. Again, I haven't read all of his writings, so but in what is available um, so far, he was concerned with kind of four areas. So he would work primarily with the church. So uh, to focus on the church is, of course, primary, but then he would work with the city governments to pass laws that reflected biblical and reformational principles. And of course, education was very important as well. So he would help to start schools, give vision for starting schools. And then the fourth thing was how the church and the city, again, in that context, were very closely linked, overlapping in many ways, but how they could deal with the massive waves of there were lots of beggars. There was a change in the economy in the late medieval period. So there was widespread poverty, and this is something that all the reformers had to deal with on some level. But Bugenhagen really cared about this, and basically said that a church is not reformed if it's not taking care of the poor, or a city is not reformed if it's not really um, working to take care of the poor in their city. So I see him as a helpful example of uh, how we can focus on four things: worship, education, working with the government as much as we can, and that's kind of the big issue with this model, and then also how we can continue in the good works of ministry and mercy. Um, but also, I just want to say that I was happy to find out these things about him because his name starts with B, and so I could interact with both the Benedict and the Boniface option, and just add another one. So
Yeah,
to the
could
mix.
I was actually gonna say, for our listeners who may not be familiar with, you know, I can't imagine there's someone who doesn't exactly know the option idea right now. But could you briefly explain the Benedict and the Boniface kind of options?
Yes, sure. So in 2016, uh, after the first, I guess, in the midst of the first Trump presidency, Roger came out with a book called the Benedict Option, and the subtitle was "A Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian Nation." And so his main argument was that we're heading into a new dark ages, and we need to stop trusting in politics to fix everything, and we need to focus on building self-sustaining communities focused on liturgical worship, worship in the deep tradition of the Christian church. He also wants to focus on classical Christian education and intentional economic support of other Christians. He also said we just need to work hard in our businesses and be prepared to work harder as we get fired because of DEI stuff. So most of that I actually kind of agree with. I think that's a good working model of things we should focus on. So there was a lot of debate back and forth on that, and people misunderstanding him, and so that's a whole other topic which I'm not actually an expert on. But then some folks in more of my circle, like C.R. Wiley, I think you had a recent guest,
Hmm.
Doug Wilson, and then Andrew Isker, probably the more controversial name here, came out with what they call the Boniface option. And so Andrew Isker actually wrote a book on it, which I actually like most of it. His main goal is for us to see the idols of our age. And so Boniface being the famous, sorry, going back to who are these guys? So Benedict being the father of Western monasticism, who started what became known as the Benedictine movement, and of course the monks did a ton of very valuable things throughout the medieval period, They were the centers of medicine, scholarship, agriculture, and so monastics did a huge amount of good. Even though they looked like they were retreating from the culture, they were actually able to impact culture in a massive way. So I think that is a valid point, that sometimes we impact the culture most by focusing on things that may not seem that important at the time. Um, so then the Boniface option once is basically more militant, more aggressive, and Saint Boniface was the medieval missionary to the Germanic peoples, and he famously chopped down this oak that was sacred to Thor. And there's legends, and it's perhaps been magnified as legends are, but that's the goal of the Boniface option, is to chop down the idols of our age and to uh, yeah, be more militant. But if you look at Andrew Isker's practical applications, they're not that different from Rod Dreher's. So I think a lot of this is just in our rhetoric, perhaps, and how we present ourselves to the to the world, and the language we
Sure.
use with each other in our own communities. But I do want to make the point that both Boniface and also Benedict, um, they both did well, so Boniface actually destroyed some idols at one point. So I'm sorry, Benedict. It's hard to get these all confused. Benedict actually destroyed some idols, and Boniface was a builder. Boniface didn't just go around chopping down idols the whole time.
Mm.
He was a builder. He was a networker. He was even an administrator who, worked for the reform of the church. And so, in some ways, these are just kind of overlapping concerns, and maybe just a difference of
No,
how
that's
we
great. Well, it
use our
sounds like,
rhetoric.
from what I'm understanding, what you're saying about the Bu- Bugenhagen. I was right there. I would have got there
Bugenhagen.
eventually. The Bugenhagen option
Yeah.
is in some ways I see a little bit of both of those two options in it. Like when you're starting with worship, it's almost like, hey, we need to be cultivated ourselves by God. We need the culture of God formed in us, and then we go out as a formed people to form the world and engage in the world and education and government and caring for the poor. And then we go back to the church, and then we're reformed, and then we kind of bring that reform into the world, and it's kind of this ebb and flow. So in some ways, there's both retreat and advance in your option. Do you see it that way, or?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's how every Christian and how the church used to operate. I mean, we have that pattern built into our week, right? We go to church on the Lord's Day. We're transformed through our worship, and then we go out like the waters going out of the temple. In the vision of Ezekiel, and we go out and we fill the world with the knowledge of God as we're able to. So yeah, I think we see this pattern maybe even in history. Sometimes there's maybe more of a retreat or a regathering, and other
Mhm.
times there's more of an advance. And so
Yeah,
we need both.
that's great.
And
Before we
so
move
yeah.
it to like our present day, one question is, how successful was Bugenhagen? Maybe that sounds like a ice cream brand too. Maybe someone wants to take that.
It does.
It's
Yes, we could start our own reformed,
Hey man, I'd
wholly
buy
reformed
that.
ice cream. Um,
Yeah.
all proceeds would go to some good cause, I'm sure. So that's always the trick with any of these models is um,
Hmm.
how long do these things last? Um, yeah, I've read quotes from Luther where he was upset or dissatisfied with the pace of reform. Within you know a few hundred years, so we have Germany being the center of higher criticism and all this liberal nonsense. Um, but even Calvin's Geneva didn't last all that long, and so in some respects, I think that's why it's important to learn from church history. Not that we can get it right this time, but that we can be both humble and confident that we do our best, and God will use our efforts for His glory. We're not sure how long it lasts, but
Doesn't I mean
yeah, we do our
I mean, that
best.
is a great
So
perspective, and I guess it always makes me sad to think about that because then you think about the things you're building and like, well, these aren't gonna last either. How do you not just get bummed out and give up? Because that's kinda what I feel like right now. I'm like, "What are we doing all this work for if it's not even gonna do anything?" How do we think about that?
right. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess there you might get into your overall eschatology, and I tend to the more post mill view, but even within that, there's ups and downs, and so even if you have what you might call a more optimistic view of history, you still have the Holocaust, you
Mm,
still have what we have now. But I think if you look at the broad trajectory of history, if you see where we've come from, and all the ways that the church has transformed culture. And I think it's yeah that there's so many ways we could um, go with that. But all these things we take for granted are the result of the gospel transforming culture. And we can look at other parts of the world and how the church is
mm.
spreading there. And we don't know what's going to happen when China, when God finally brings full Reformation in China. Who knows? So we don't know, but we know that we're called to be faithful right now. So whether I guess the same thing might perhaps be said if you're struggling with any issue, whether it's chronic disease, illness, whatever. We can't give up. We need to keep going and trust that God
No,
knows
that's
what He's
good.
doing.
Well, and that's great. I mean, even just thinking about Calvin's Geneva is, hey, that didn't last forever. But how many of us are looking back to that and thinking, what an amazing feat, what an amazing thing that God did, and then it gives us possibly an example of what we can do now, or at least it shows us what God can do in history when things are looking bleak. Things were not
Mhm.
easy for Calvin. When things were looking bleak, we can dig in and actually have maybe another golden age or something of Christianity, right, on this trajectory of history. The Lord is
Well,
is doing something
and the
here, and
fact that we're
so
still talking
with
about that
that,
500 years
how
later or whatever, says that it's obviously done something.
exactly.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly right. And with that, how do you think the Bugenhagen option, if we were as Christians, let's say most of the Western Christianity said, all right, we're going to do this Bugenhagen option and we're going to do it. How, what what kind of things practically do you think we could start doing right now in our local communities to start kind of implementing this thing?
Yeah. Great question. Um, and here, here's where some of my limitations as a historian will be obvious. So, the great thing about history is you can live in the past, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I'm not an expert on all of the various issues that are confronting us right now, and so I'm definitely learning a lot. Um, but I think his his priorities give us again these four things that we can work on no matter where we are and no matter our context. And so I wrote this article for just everyone, and I think something that American Christians need to really get right is the priority of the church and the importance of worship. That is not
Hmm.
negotiable.
Hmm.
And so that's where we really need to focus our efforts, because if the church is not doing what she's supposed to do, we can't expect the culture, to have any idea of what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
So,
Can I ask one
yeah.
question about that, about worship? Because I agree with you, and I think it's so important. But what do you think? If someone were to push back on it and say, "Hey, I get that we're supposed to worship, but I don't understand how that's supposed to affect culture or cultivate culture in any way." How do you think
Mhm.
worship and the faithful gathering of God's people does that?
Right. Yeah. So, worship is the center of every culture,
Mm,
and every culture has a quote unquote religion, even communism, right? That was
Mhm.
a worldview that had its own myth, rituals, purification ceremonies, and its own eschatology. So every culture has um, a series of practices and governing myths that holds it together. And if we don't have a strong sense of historic liturgical worship, we're just going to drift along with the culture. And so, uh, strong worship creates strong people. And so, thorough, lively, robust worship produces robust people. And I think it's Pastor Yuri perhaps talking, I forget, but most current worship services are more spectator sports, right? Where
Mm.
people go and watch other people perform
Mhm.
musically or in a short sermon. And then so they're in a consumer mindset. And so they take that out into culture and they just consume whatever the American culture is giving them. So we need to focus on a worship of people who are actively engaged and are producing, and then that creates people who go out into the culture and then they produce, they transform,
Mm.
they they start thinking, huh, things could be different, and so worship uh, changes our social imaginary, to use the term that Charles Taylor used. So really, this is all about giving us more examples, both in history of what's possible and also in worship, how that changes the way we think about everything. And so I think that's
Mhm.
the benefit of historically informed worship that's not just made up, every Sunday or in every, 10 years. Now, what are we
Right.
going to do for worship?
No, that's great. And then so I do kind of want to hit all of those four main things. So worship, education, government, and then kind of care for poverty. And so then the next one, education, that one maybe seems a little easier to understand how that can affect culture because
Right.
it's bringing in this generational kind of aspect of it. But yeah, can you cast the vision for education and how that affects culture in the same way that you kind of did with
Yes.
worship?
Yeah. Well, I think again, this is where Christians are very naive, and historically, uh, we just don't know our history. But if you look at communist Russia, if you look at other societies, they know that education is primary, and so the main way that they wanted to change the future was to change the education. And so, as Christians, we are um, thankfully, there's been a revival of Christian education. There's been a revival of classical Christian education, and so I like to think of it as we are training the next generation of reformers. If you look at, all of the reformers came out of a certain educational system. It was basically Northern humanism, but they were taking advantage of the latest results in scholarship and, in the production of books and the study of the church fathers and the Greek and Hebrew. So, yeah, so this is, why I continue to be a teacher, even though I could make a lot more money doing computers or, something. Um, but I know that I am training the next generation of leaders. And I've had, former students go off and start businesses and, you
Mhm.
know, be in the military and do all sorts of amazing things. And they're out there doing it. They're out there starting schools now, which is really quite funny, to have kids who didn't appreciate what they were doing in high school. Now they're starting their own school.
Mhm.
Um, so if you take the long term vision, um, that this is transformational. And now it's not our savior. We have to be careful that by itself education, can give people enough knowledge, to rebel if it's not
Right.
done well. So um, all this needs to operate with the Spirit of God and also under His blessing.
Right. And That's awesome. We've actually, our church has started a school, and we are completely on board with this idea too. We think it's so important. I mean, the generational aspect is so crucial um, to this. So I appreciate that being a focus of your model here. And then third, you put government, and that could be a bit of a sticky conversation. I don't know. There's a lot of just tensions and vitriol, going all about that. So, thinking of Christians influencing culture governmentally, how are you thinking through that in this model?
Right. Yeah. Well, it's I guess ironic that we're talking about this right before tomorrow when we all go vote
Right.
for the next president, right? um, so yeah, I'm not going to really talk about our present moment too much.
Right.
Again, I'm not an expert, and my goal as a historical theologian is to uh, help us to learn from the past, so that no matter what moment we're in, you
Hmm.
know, regardless of who's president tomorrow, that we will still have the same basic marching orders, the same basic model.
Right.
So
What kind of
yes,
principles
some
can we carry over
yeah,
from the
right,
past? That's great.
exactly, exactly. So yeah, I would just say be involved in your local government as much as you can, and so instead of just focusing on who's president, what's going on in your local town. So I'm a
Mhm.
big advocate of local action, of churches just really being part of their local community. I've heard and read great stories about how pastors go and pray and meet their local mayor,
Mhm.
just how churches can become known as places that serve the community, that love the community, and challenge it, where appropriate, where necessary. Um, so yeah, I don't think there's any quick fixes to our political mess. So I would again recommend places like Hillsdale College. I've heard great things about them, where they focus on reading the primary sources
Mm.
of our American founding.
Mhm.
And so again, even there, it's the work of history and really digging into the theology of politics. Most Christians just have no understanding of what the Bible says about government, how the church has engaged the issue of politics, throughout history. So really, I think we're in the first stages of retrieving our inheritance
Mm.
and building on that inheritance. So I'm not a politician. I don't have any silver bullets, but I think one thing we can do is learn from the past, which I think the folks at American Reformer are doing a great job.
Mhm.
I would recommend the Hale Institute podcast.
Hmm.
They've had a bunch of really insightful guests on there who are are experts on all these areas. So definitely check out that Hale Institute podcast. Um, so yeah, that is my short. But again, that's kind of the weakness of my model is
Mm.
Bugenhagen had the support of the town governments that he was working for.
Right.
We're more in the or moving towards the situation of the early church, as we live more and more in what Aaron Wren has called the negative world.
Mhm.
So that's why I also brought in John Chrysostom, however you want to say it.
Right.
So as an example from the early church, and so I'm kind of blending models from the early church and the
Mhm.
Reformation. I know that's anachronistic, but again, these are our brothers in the faith, and I think we can learn things from both of them, all of them.
Right. Well, and I think that's a helpful understanding. The principle that I am gathering from what you said that's having an impact on me is just the local aspect, the localism. Be involved in what you can locally. I think so many Christians are so concerned with the national scale that we can fail to understand that we can have a real impact where we live. And then, like you said, the context that we're in isn't, we don't have the government behind us encouraging Christianity and Christian laws and Christian morality. But maybe if we reform our worship and make it robust and biblical and true and really exalting of Christ. And then we also form these educational institutions. Maybe a few generations down the road, we will have a government we're in a position to where, we could do
Mhm.
that. Who knows? Um,
Right.
but
Yeah.
then that kind of leads into that fourth aspect, which I really appreciate in your article. I think you spent some extra time talking about social action or helping with poverty, because I mean, as conservative Christians, we really don't want to be called liberals, right? We want to really avoid, hey, I want to, we can't talk about social justice because I don't want to be called a liberal. And obviously, social justice
Right.
has been abused and has been perverted by the left and all that. But how does that play into your model of
Mhm.
engaging the culture, changing the culture?
Right. Yes. Yeah. And so yeah, this is really kind of my own personal process of working through these issues in the past, before the whole BLM stuff,
Hmm.
pre 2020. It was more okay to talk about these things and to be involved in these things. So at that time we were in the South, and so I was able to help our church, help some other churches, you know, to build bridges between black and white churches,
Hmm.
to get our church to be aware of, there's actually people just down the road from where we meet, and they're going hungry.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so I was, so yeah, I didn't realize how quickly this would go sideways, but um, after 2020, it was like, wow, this is crazy. But I do remember one leader. I was at a meeting, and this well-respected civil rights leader, uh, someone who I do respect quite a bit. This was like right after the Obergefell decision, I believe, and he was saying that gay marriage is not our issue, and he's speaking primarily for the black community. He said that kids killing each other in Chicago is our issue. And that made me really pause and say, wait a minute, why can't they both be our issues?
Right.
Um, and so, what I'm trying to push back against is this separation of, sexual issues, and then, there are things that's okay to talk about as a Christian and be trendy.
Hmm.
And so, even as a conservative, you can talk about some things and get applause from everybody else. But once you start talking about other things, then um, folks get angry. So I want to maintain what I'm calling reformational justice,
Hmm.
which is justice that's, first of all, founded on the Bible, but then also on the classical Christian tradition. So I'm actually working on a book right now with Dr. George Grant, who's been a
Hmm.
long time inspiration, and I respect his combination of what I might call scholastic activism,
Hmm.
where he's involved with all sorts of things. His wife helped to start one of the first um, crisis pregnancy centers back in the days when that wasn't really done. He's helped to start classical Christian schools in other countries, in Muslim countries,
Hmm.
but he's also focused on scholarship. And so we need both. We need smart activism. We need historically informed activism. We cannot abandon this work to the government. We love to criticize the bloated administrative state, right?
Hmm.
But if they stopped all their services and said, okay, we're not going to do anything else, um, you all do it. Would we be ready to meet the needs of people in our towns,
Hmm.
who we know better than this huge this big bureaucracy? So these are our neighbors. So we need to find out what are the needs of our towns. Um, how can we meet some of them? Start small. Don't jump into the deep end of the pool. And work with other churches. One church
Hmm.
cannot do all this. So yeah, there are questions about the role of the government, the role of the church, how this would work. But rather than just being critical, I would say let's step up our game. Let's get out there. Let's do it. Um, but yeah, let's not abandon this arena just because it's been abused and because it's been done, I guess, poorly. Oh, and one other point, I guess I did want to make this earlier.
Yeah.
But the term liturgy, if you go back to ancient Greek
Hmm.
and the ancient Roman context, the classical context, comes from the word liturgia, which means, well, yes, it's the work of the people,
Hmm.
but these were works of public service, what was called benefaction,
Hmm.
where you would build a building for the town, you would put on you know some festival, you would fund a public religious festival, and yeah, that was good for you, good for the city, and so it's interesting how the church started using this word where worship should benefit um, the whole community. And so, and we see this in various places in the Bible. But we're supposed to be conspicuous for our good deeds. We shouldn't be Pharisees. We shouldn't be trumpeting our horn. But the early pagans knew that Christians rescued babies. They knew that Christians welcomed slaves and rich together in their worship service, and that was weird. Um, so we should be doing things are that make us weird in
Hmm.
the eyes of the world, um, which is not hard because just having kids now makes you weird.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's a helpful thing too. I mean, just the communal aspect of the church. As we come together in worship, we are doing something completely countercultural, and while it's probably not the main focus of worship, you doing that together every week trains us to go against the grain of the culture. I mean, it teaches us how to be a people who are different, and I think that's a really great point. And as we finish up, Craig, do you have any last questions for him
No, I think
before
it's
we
great. I think
close
you
down?
that Bugenhagen Hagen Das. Uh, yeah,
You're
I
gonna
know.
forever
Sorry.
stumble
Well,
on how to say that.
I say something wrong once and then it gets locked in, and it can never be changed. Um, I don't think
Oh
he'll
yeah.
care though.
Yep. Yep.
But I think those four kind of pillars. What I like about a historian coming at it is you're like, listen, it's not my job to apply it. I'm just telling you what the categories are. It's your job to figure out how to use it. And even for our listeners, I think for them to
Hmm.
say, hey, I'm going to think about worship, government, engagement, education, care for the poor, and mercy ministry. These are some categories that we all need to be thinking about if we want to be Christians in the world. Those are all categories we need to find levels of engagement in as our capacity allows. So I think it's really helpful and open handed for us to now seek wisdom as churches to apply these in our context.
Yeah, and Dr. Soderberg, do you have any final remarks or anything that you wanted to
Hmm.
talk about that I just failed to ask you about?
Oh no, this has been fun. But yeah, I did appreciate you actually sent me an article I had not read before, by Tim and Klein and also Clifford Humphrey.
Hmm.
And they have something which they kind of call the Alfred option, which is
Hmm.
not a B, but okay, well it's okay. But yeah, they
Oh,
talk
the
about how we should
Balfred
build.
option.
Yeah, right. Uh, so yeah, they recommend building fortresses to have more of
Hmm.
a fortress mentality, and I think it's actually very helpful. And so we need to find other like-minded Christians. So yes, work with Christians in your own town as much as you can, but also we need to, as we're doing here, find other like-minded people,
Hmm.
learn from each other. Um, you know, um, go visit each other's churches, each other's communities, learn from each other, and yeah, just have more of that mentality where we are digging in, but we're not just going to wait for something to happen. We're going to be a little more on the offensive here, and we're going to have more strategy. And as evangelicals and as conservatives, we're most often reacting to things. We
Hmm.
see something on the news, and then we just react to it. And so I think studying history can help us to be more proactive, to say, okay, how are we like New England? How are we
Mhm.
like the early church? How, and it, even for our brothers and sisters in other countries, which
Mhm.
have very different histories. There's lots of parallels, and we can learn from them as well. So we need to cultivate those relationships as best we can.
No, yeah, that's incredible. Thank you so much for taking the time for explaining all this. I really do think that this is a helpful model that that we can take as Christians and build on. And those four pillars are really actually applicable in our lives, in our daily lives. So I think this is something that hopefully our listeners, if you're listening to this, you can take these four things: worship, education, government, and social action, and taking the gospel out into your actual city right outside your door. Those are actionable things that you can start thinking through and doing right now. So yeah, Dr. Soderberg, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you. This has been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been incredible. And so, guys, go. We're gonna go and have our Ale House episode with Dr. Soderberg. So be sure to go check out our Patreon so you can hear that, and then make sure to go check out our website. We've got some merch on there, some shirts and hats and other things you can buy. So go check those things out. And until next time, labora ad gloriam.